Micah's fund, sweetheart, that money's already spoken for. My mother said it the way she'd mention the weather, not even looking up from the birthday cake she was frosting, while my 8-year-old son stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, holding a report card he had run the entire length of the backyard to show her. Before I tell you what I found 3 days later in an envelope that was never supposed to reach my mailbox, I want to know where you're listening from tonight. Drop it in the comments, because by the time this story is over, I don't think anyone in my family expected the daughter they always called the quiet one to be the one who finally burned it all down, calmly, legally, and completely. My name is Ren Alvarez. I'm a pharmacist at Brookhaven Memorial, the kind of job where people trust you with the exact right dose, because getting it wrong costs someone their life. I've built a career on precision, on double-checking, on never letting a decimal point move where it shouldn't. I've also spent the last 3 years being precise about something no one in my family ever noticed. Raising my son alone after my husband David died in a highway accident 2 weeks before Micah's 5th birthday. David was careful in the way engineers are careful. He labeled things. He kept spreadsheets of his own, long before I ever had to learn how. Before the funeral even happened, his coworkers were already calling me about paperwork, a life insurance policy, and something else, a modest trust he'd set up the year Micah was born, funded a little at a time out of every overtime check, meant to grow quietly until college. David hadn't trusted lawyers he didn't know personally, so when the paperwork needed a second signature, someone steady, someone family, he'd put my mother down as trustee. Not because he loved her more than me. Because at the time, grief had turned me into someone who forgot to eat some days, who stood in the shower until the water went cold, and Sylvia Castell has never in her life forgotten a single form, a single deadline, a single obligation that made her look responsible. I let her keep the role after that first year, even once I'd found my footing again. That was my mistake, and I'll say it plainly, because everything after this story starts with that one small, exhausted decision to let someone else hold something precious for a while, and to keep trusting her to hold it long after I no longer needed the help. For 3 years, my mother sent me a spreadsheet every January. Growth numbers, contribution notes, a tidy column showing Micah's future ticking upward, always rounded to the nearest 100, always accompanied by a cheerful note about compound interest. I never questioned it. I was working double shifts some months, raising a grieving little boy by myself, going to his parent-teacher conferences alone, learning how to braid a rope for a school project I'd never made before, and some tired, trusting part of me needed to believe that at least one thing in my life was being taken care of, without my having to fight for it. Meanwhile, my sister Dana's household ran on a different kind of arithmetic. Her husband Trevor's contracting business had been about to turn a corner, for 2 years running. Every family dinner came with a new emergency, a missed payroll, a lawsuit from a subcontractor over a collapsed retaining wall, a truck repossessed in the middle of the night while the twins watched from the window. And every time my mother found a way to help. Not loudly, just steadily, quietly, the way water finds the lowest point in a room and settles there without anyone noticing the floor has tilted. I told myself it wasn't my business. I told myself that on the drive to Wyatt and Nora's 9th birthday party, the twins' names stitched onto a bounce house rental big enough to need its own generator, parked in a backyard my mother had strung with professional party lighting. I told myself it again when Micah tugged my sleeve at the dessert table and asked, in the careful whisper he uses when he already suspects the answer, "Mom, is it okay that I didn't get invited to help blow out candles?" It wasn't the bounce house that broke something in me. It wasn't even the moment my mother handed Wyatt a wrapped box that turned out to be a $1,200 drone, while Micah stood 2 feet away holding a card with $11 folded inside it. His actual birthday had been 6 weeks earlier, and this, apparently, was makeup, a debt paid in a stray envelope instead of presents. It was the report card. Micah had made honor roll for the first time all year. He'd been practicing what he'd say to Grandma Sylvia the entire car ride over, rehearsing it under his breath like a kid preparing for a spelling bee, folding and unfolding the paper until the crease went soft. And when he finally worked up the courage to interrupt her mid-frosting, tugging gently at her sleeve, she glanced at the paper for less than 2 seconds before her attention slid back to the cake, back to the candles, back to Wyatt calling her name from across the yard. That's when Micah asked, in the smallest voice I have ever heard him use, whether the money Dad left him could maybe go toward the robotics camp he'd been begging to attend all spring, the one with the 8-week wait list and the deposit due by Friday. That's when my mother said the line that started all of this. "Micah's fund? Sweetheart, that money's already spoken for." I remember setting my cup down very carefully on the counter, the way you do when your hands have started shaking and you don't want anyone to see. I asked her what she meant. She waved a spatula at me like I was being dramatic over nothing, said we'd talk about it later, and called Wyatt over to help her light the candles, her voice sliding back into its bright party register, as if nothing had happened at all. We didn't talk about it later. 3 days after that party, an envelope arrived at my house by mistake. The bank system had glitched during an address update and sent a duplicate statement to my address instead of my mother's. I almost didn't open it. My name wasn't on the account, and I've never made a habit of opening mail that isn't mine. I told myself it was junk mail, some kind of marketing insert, and I set it on the counter while I made dinner. I told myself that, right up until Micah went to bed and the kitchen went quiet, and something about the return address kept pulling my eyes back to it until I finally tore it open and saw whose name was on the account number in the corner and whose name wasn't in the balance anymore. The statement showed Micah's education trust, the one David had built dollar by dollar out of overtime pay before he died, sitting at $11,200. It should have been closer to $41,000. I sat at the kitchen table and read that number 4 times, certain I was misreading a comma, certain the bank had transposed a digit somewhere. But the transaction history ran for 3 pages, and every line told the same story. 3 years of steady contributions from David's original setup, and a balance that had been quietly bleeding out in withdrawals I'd never approved, never even known were possible, going back almost 2 years. I sat with that statement until the numbers stopped looking like numbers, and started looking like a timeline. I traced every withdrawal against a date I could remember from somewhere else in my life. A $4,000 transfer the same week Trevor's truck got repossessed. I remembered because Dana had called me crying about it, asking if I could talk to Mom. $2,200, gone, the week before the twins started private tutoring for the state exams. $6,000, withdrawn in a single transaction 4 days before Dana and Trevor put a down payment on a lake house I'd only ever seen in photos on Dana's page. Captioned, "Blessed," with a string of heart emojis under a picture of Wyatt cannonballing off a dock. My mother hadn't just been careless with my son's money. She'd been funding my sister's life with it, one crisis at a time, and calling it keeping things in the family. I didn't call her. I didn't call Dana. I sat with it for 4 days, because I have never once in my life made a good decision while I was still shaking, and I wasn't about to start with something this size. Instead, I called Priya first, my closest friend at the pharmacy, the person who'd covered my shifts without being asked the week of David's funeral, and never once brought it up afterward like it owed her something. I read her the numbers over the phone at 11 at night, and she was quiet for a long moment before she said, "Ren, that's not a family thing anymore. That's a legal thing. You know that, right?" I think some part of me had needed to hear it from someone outside the blood of it before I could let myself believe it. Then I called my Aunt Ceci, my mother's sister, the only person in that family who has ever spoken to me like I was a full adult, and not the quiet, easy one who wouldn't make waves. Ceci went quiet for a long moment when I read her the numbers. Then she told me something I hadn't known, that 18 months earlier, at a family dinner I'd missed because Micah had strep throat, my mother had joked about how trustee was really just a fancy word for family bank, and everyone at the table had laughed except Ceci, who'd gone home that night and not been able to sleep, though she hadn't known why until now. That's when I stopped thinking of this as a misunderstanding and started building a case. I requested the full transaction history directly from the bank, which is my legal right as Micah's parent, even though I wasn't the trustee. I printed every withdrawal, every date, every amount, and matched them one by one against Dana and Trevor's public spending, the lake house closing date pulled from the county property records, a new SUV registered in Trevor's name 3 weeks after an $8,000 withdrawal, a family trip to Cabo that Dana had posted 11 photos from with the caption, "We deserve this," time-stamped 6 days after another transfer cleared. I built a folder, I built a timeline, color-coded the way I color-code medication schedules, Because chaos has never once helped me solve anything, and I wasn't going to let this be the first exception. I did not raise my voice once through any of it. Not at my mother on the phone when she called to ask why I'd gone cold. Not at my sister in the single text I sent her asking her to please not discuss any of this with Micah. Not even alone in my car where no one could have heard me anyway. Some old, stubborn part of me still believed that if I stayed calm enough, careful enough, this could be resolved like a dosage error. Caught, corrected, documented, and never repeated. Inés Prado, the attorney I found through a coworker whose own custody case she'd handled 2 years earlier, looked through everything in under 20 minutes and said 4 words I will never forget. This is embezzlement, Ren. Not mismanagement. Not a family favor gone too far. A trustee, legally bound to act in a minor beneficiary's sole interest, had instead funneled that child's inheritance to another branch of the family, repeatedly, deliberately, and for years, while sending me cheerful spreadsheets that made it look untouched. But it got worse before it got any better. While Inés was preparing a formal accounting demand, Ceci called me again, her voice tight in a way I'd never heard from her before. She'd been going through old paperwork after my grandmother's passing the year before, boxes that had sat in Ceci's garage since the estate closed, and she'd found something, a second, older trust, one my grandmother had set up for all of her grandchildren equally, meant to be split evenly among Dana's twins, and Micah once each turned 18. My mother had been the trustee of that one too, appointed by my grandmother in the last year of her life, when she was too tired to argue about who deserved the responsibility more. Ceci pulled the most recent statement she could find, and read me the balance over the phone, her voice catching on the number. My grandmother's trust had already been fully drained, every dollar of Micah's third redirected, the records showed, into a college fund that existed only for Wyatt and Nora, opened the same month the original balance had emptied out. 2 separate funds. 2 separate acts of trust, from 2 different people who had loved my son and trusted my mother to protect what they'd left him. One version of my son who was never, as far as my mother was concerned, meant to inherit anything at all. I remember standing in my kitchen with the phone against my ear, watching Micah through the window, building something out of cardboard and tape in the backyard, utterly unaware that 2 grandparents' worth of care for his future had been quietly erased before he was even old enough to know it existed. I made a decision standing right there, watching him. Whatever this cost, in family, in holidays, in the version of normal I'd been protecting him inside of, he was never going to grow up learning that being the quiet one meant going without. The dinner I called for was the first one I'd ever organized myself, and my mother looked almost pleased when I invited her, like she assumed I was finally ready to let the birthday comment go and put things back the way they'd always been. I sat Micah at Priya's apartment for a sleepover that night, the first one he'd ever had, and told him only that the grown-ups needed to talk about boring money things. He didn't ask twice. He never does. My parents arrived first. My mother in the cream blazer she wears when she wants to look unbothered, my father trailing a step behind her the way he always does, like a man permanently walking into weather he didn't check for. Dana and Trevor came 15 minutes later, Dana already talking before she'd taken her coat off, something about traffic, something about how she'd almost not made it because Trevor had a site inspection running late. I let her finish. I've learned that people reveal more of themselves in the minutes before they know what's coming than in any of the minutes after. I didn't accuse anyone. I just set the folder on the table, opened it, and started reading dates and dollar amounts out loud, flat and even, the way I'd read a dosage chart to a nurse on a night shift. $4,000, the week of the repossession. $2,200, the week before tutoring began. $6,000, 4 days before a lake house closing. $8,000, 3 weeks before a new SUV. Somewhere around the 4th line item, my mother stopped pretending to look confused and started looking cornered instead, her jaw tightening in a way I recognized from every argument she'd ever lost and refused to admit losing. Dana's face went the color of the tablecloth. Trevor didn't say a single word the entire time. He just stared at his hands like the numbers were somehow his to be ashamed of, which, in fairness, they were. I finished with the second trust. I watched my mother's face when I said my grandmother's name. Watched something flicker there that might have been shame if she'd let it stay long enough to become that, before it hardened back into defense. Family helps family, Renata, she said finally, her voice tight and clipped, the tone she uses when she believes she's the reasonable one, in a room full of people overreacting. David would have wanted his son to help his cousins. I told her that David had wanted his son to go to college, and that she didn't get to decide, unilaterally and in secret, whose future mattered more, using money that was never hers to redistribute. My father cleared his throat and said quietly that maybe we could work something out privately, as a family. The same sentence he has used my entire life to mean, don't make this someone's problem to solve out loud. I told him there was nothing left to work out privately. It had already happened. Now there was only the question of what happened next. That night, I filed a formal petition for accounting and removal of trustee in probate court, with Ines representing Micah's interests directly. I also filed a police report for the grandmother's trust, since that one wasn't a gray area of family generosity dressed up in good intentions. It was a documented breach, with a paper trail that led in one direction only, and a fiduciary duty that had been violated in writing, in dates, in numbers a court could read for itself without needing to hear anyone's version of events. The fallout arrived exactly the way I expected, which is to say, loudly, and almost entirely by phone. My mother called 11 times before noon the next day. I let each one go to voicemail, and by the fourth message her tone had shifted from wounded to furious, accusing me of airing family business like a stranger, of punishing her for loving her grandchildren, as if loving one grandchild had ever required starving another of what was legally, unambiguously his. My father, who has never once in 65 years taken a side against my mother, left a single voicemail asking me to think about what this does to the family. As if the family hadn't already decided, 3 years ago and one withdrawal at a time, exactly what it was willing to do to my son. Dana texted me a single line the next morning. You humiliated mom in front of everyone for money you don't even need. I sat with that message longer than I want to admit before I typed anything back, because some old part of me still wanted to explain myself to her, to make her understand. In the end, I only wrote, this was never about whether we needed it. It was about whether it was his. I didn't send anything after that, and she didn't write back. My neighbor, Mrs. Halloway, a retired schoolteacher who has lived next door since before David and I bought the house, caught me taking out the trash 2 days later and asked, gently, if everything was all right. She'd noticed the extra cars in my driveway, noticed I looked like I hadn't slept. I told her more than I meant to, standing there in the cold with the bin between us, and she listened without once telling me I was being too harsh, or not harsh enough, which I realized, standing there, was the first conversation about any of this that hadn't come with an agenda attached. Before I went back inside, she said something I kept turning over for days afterward. She said some families protect the peace, yours protected the performance of it. Those aren't the same thing, and you were never wrong for noticing the difference. The probate hearing was set for late autumn, which meant 6 weeks of waiting, and waiting has never been a season that suits me. In that time, my mother tried 3 different approaches, each one a full costume change from the last. First came contrition, a handwritten card, left in my mailbox rather than mailed, saying she'd always meant to pay it back eventually, and that she never thought of it as stealing, just borrowing forward. I read it twice, and put it in the folder with everything else, because intentions have never once shown up as a line item on a bank statement. Then came anger. A voicemail, 7 minutes long, accusing me of destroying this family over a technicality, of caring more about winning than about keeping Micah close to his cousins, her voice rising and cracking in places I'd only ever heard at funerals. I didn't call back. Then, finally, silence, which was almost a relief, because at least silence didn't ask anything of me, didn't require me to manage anyone's feelings about consequences that were, by any measure, entirely of her own making. Dana's silence was harder to sit with than my mother's anger, in a strange way. We'd never gone more than a week without talking since we were kids sharing a bedroom, since sleepovers and matching Halloween costumes, and the particular shorthand sisters billed without meaning to. 6 weeks of nothing from her felt like a held breath. I found myself, more than once, picking up my phone to send her something small and stupid. A meme, a photo of Micah's latest cardboard invention, the kind of nothing message that used to be the whole architecture of our relationship. and putting the phone back down each time, because I didn't yet know what kind of sister I'd be allowed to be to her on the other side of this. Ceci called every few days, not to check on the case, but just to talk, the way an aunt is supposed to, and somewhere in those weeks she became something closer to a mother than my own mother had managed to be in years. She told me one evening that she'd started her own version of a folder. Old photographs, old letters from my grandmother, things she thought Micah might want someday, proof that at least 2 women in this family had loved him uncomplicatedly, without conditions attached, before any of this happened. I cried on the phone with her for the first time since David's funeral, and she let me, without once telling me to be strong about it. Priya covered 3 of my shifts that month without being asked, the same way she had 3 years earlier, and when I tried to thank her for it over coffee in the break room, she just shrugged and said, "You'd have done it for me." "You basically already have, twice." It struck me, sitting there, how much of the last 3 years had been built out of people who'd shown up quietly and consistently, never once needing a spreadsheet to prove it. The day before the hearing, I sat Micah down and told him, in the plainest words I could find for an 8-year-old, that Grandma had made a mistake with money that was supposed to be his, and that a judge was going to help fix it. I braced for questions I didn't have good answers for. Instead, he thought about it for a long moment, the way he does before he says anything that matters, and asked only, "Is it because of the drone?" I told him it was about more than the drone, but yes, some of it was exactly that noticing the drone had been the first true thing he'd felt in a long time, and he shouldn't ever doubt it just because grown-ups took a while to catch up to what he'd already understood standing in that kitchen. Ines prepared me the way she prepares every client, walking me through what the judge would likely ask, what Sylvia's attorney would likely argue, warning me that informal family loan was almost certainly the defense we'd hear, since there was no paperwork, no interest, no repayment schedule to call it anything else. She was right. When the hearing began, my mother's attorney stood and described 3 years of documented, unauthorized withdrawals as flexible family financial support, a phrase so carefully hollow it almost impressed me, the way a well-worded lie sometimes does before you remember to be angry about it instead. Ceci testified first, calm and precise, in a way I hadn't expected from someone I'd only ever seen cry at Thanksgiving over too much wine and too many memories. She described the joke about the family bank, the date, the dinner, the way no one at that table had thought to question it out loud except her. She described going through my grandmother's boxes, finding the second trust, understanding for the first time what she was looking at. Her voice didn't waver once. Then came the bank records, which don't have feelings to manage or reputations to protect. They simply told the truth in dates and dollar signs, laid out on a projector screen in a courtroom that smelled like old carpet and coffee, each withdrawal appearing beside its matching expense the way Ines and I had built it, weeks earlier at my kitchen table. My mother's attorney tried again to frame it as informal lending, tried to suggest that family arrangements don't always require documentation, but the judge, a woman named Judge Osei, with reading glasses pushed low on her nose, and the kind of patience that comes from having heard every excuse a person can invent to explain away someone else's money, cut him off gently and asked a single question that undid the whole argument in one sentence. "Counselor, do you have a single document, from either trust, showing any intent or attempt to repay these funds?" He didn't. My mother was asked to testify. She sat very straight, hands folded, and said the same thing she'd said at my dining table, in nearly the same words, as though she'd rehearsed it in the days between. Family helps family. She said she'd always intended to balance it out eventually, that she'd never meant for it to look the way it looked on paper. Judge Osei listened without interrupting, then asked her, plainly, whether she had ever informed either grandchild's parent, meaning me, of any of these withdrawals at the time they occurred. My mother was quiet for a long moment before she said, "No, I didn't want to worry anyone." The judge wrote something down and didn't ask anything else. It wasn't instant, and it wasn't clean. The judge removed my mother as trustee of both funds, before the first hearing had even closed, ordered a full financial accounting of every withdrawal across both trusts, and set a repayment schedule tied directly to Dana and Trevor's assets, since they were the ones who had received the money, knowingly, over and over again, regardless of who had signed the withdrawal slip. Trevor's business took the hit hardest. The lake house went up for sale within 4 months, And Dana, in a short, stiff email that felt more like a formality than a reconciliation, told me she understood why it had to happen this way, though she stopped short of saying she was sorry, and I stopped short of expecting her to. Micah's original trust was restored, not with an apology, but with an actual court-enforced correction, every dollar of the drained balance scheduled for repayment over 18 months. A licensed independent fiduciary now manages both accounts. Not family, not friends, just someone whose entire job is making sure an 8-year-old's future belongs to him and no one else. Someone who sends quarterly statements with no cheerful notes attached, only numbers, which is, I've come to realize, exactly how I prefer it now. My mother and I don't speak much these days. She calls on his birthday, and on the anniversary of David's death, and I let it go to voicemail more often than not out of cruelty, but because some doors don't need to be slammed to stay closed, they just need to stop being propped open by guilt. My father sends a card twice a year, always signed only from him, which is its own quiet kind of apology I've chosen to accept without asking him to say it out loud, because I think it's the only kind he has left to give. Dana and I are civil at the handful of gatherings I still attend for the twins' sake, because Wyatt and Nora didn't choose any of this, and I refuse to let them inherit a grudge that was never theirs to carry. We don't talk the way we used to. The closeness we used to have, the kind built on my staying quiet so she could stay comfortable, that's gone, and most days, I've stopped grieving it. Micah started robotics camp that spring, paid for out of an account with his name on it, and no one else's fingerprints in the ledger. He came home the first day with grease on his hands and a small motorized claw he'd built himself, holding it up to me the way he'd once held up a report card nobody looked at. This time, I looked. I looked for as long as he needed me to, and I asked him to explain the gearing to me twice, not because I didn't understand it the first time, but because I wanted him to feel, in his body, what it's like to have someone actually want to know. Some evenings now, I sit on the back porch after he's asleep, and I think about how quiet I used to be, how good I got at swallowing things, because it was easier than making anyone uncomfortable. How many years I spent mistaking my own silence for peace, when it was really just other people's comfort, purchased at my expense and my son's. I don't know that version of myself anymore, and I don't miss her. Priya and I still cover each other's shifts, though there's less need for it now that the chaos has settled into something steadier. Ceci comes over most Sundays, and she and Micah have started a slow, patient project, rebuilding an old radio she found in my grandmother's things, the two of them at the kitchen table with a soldering iron and a stack of diagrams, filling the house with the kind of noise I used to think only came from big, crowded family gatherings, and have since learned can just as easily come from two people who actually want to be in the same room. Mrs. Halloway still catches me at the mailbox sometimes, and last month she told me she'd watched Micah ride his bike past her porch 3 times in a row just to wave, and that he looked, in her words, like a boy who knows exactly where he stands with the people who matter. I thought about that phrase for a long time afterward, where he stands. As if love were a piece of ground you could actually be certain of, instead of something you had to keep proving you deserved. If there's one thing this whole ordeal has taught me, it's this. Love that asks a child to compete for scraps was never love at all. It was accounting, dressed up in birthday wrapping paper and family loyalty, and it only works for as long as no one opens the folder. The moment you stop being afraid to read the numbers out loud is the moment the people who counted on your silence lose their power over you completely, and you get to decide, finally, who actually belongs at your table. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of a silence you're ready to break, take a moment to like this video and tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Subscribe if you want more stories about the quiet ones who finally stopped staying quiet. I'll see you in the next one.